Hi, we are live and back on GaryCon Live, Twitch. Thank you if you stuck around. Thank you for sticking around. And if you are just going to join us here in a minute, this introduction will be irrelevant anyway. So we are GaryCon 14, Ethereal GaryCon live all weekend long, starting earlier this morning and going 24 hours a day through Sunday. Once with pickups from Australia next at 10 o'clock tonight, and then Germany going into the wee hours of the morning stateside. We'll have gaming content all weekend. We had just had a great Cyberpunk Red game with Eric Frankhouse as the game master, and some industry powerhouses in that game as well, from Wizards of the Coast, Amanda Hammond from Wizards of the Coast, Alexander Stangram from Cobalt Press, Adriana Cazador, and then one of the players from Eric's game, Kelly. Oh my gosh, I forgot her last name. No, she's going to kill me. Anyway, Kelly was also one of the players in that game. It was super fun. If you go back and look in our archive, go back and look at the Twitch archive.
So rude. What kind of host are you?
Kelly Dawson. There we go. Saved myself. All right. But now we are going to take. We are very honored to have Keith Baker with the creator of Eberron, among many other things, with us to chat about world building and Eberron and what he's doing these days. So welcome, Keith. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. Sad I missed the Cyberpunk game. I love some Cyberpunk.
Yeah, it was very zany. He had a kind of a Running Man type spin on it. So they were all convicts trying to escape some sort of televised death game. So it was a lot of fun.
Sounds fun.
Yeah. So you've got a lot going on now. In fact, we were just talking about some of the Eberron stuff, but you want to start with like Together and how that's involved in your life these days?
Sure. So back about 5 or 6 years ago, I started a company called Together Studios. That's TWO, just to confuse things. And the first thing we put out actually was a role-playing game called Phoenix Dawn Command. Which I love. It's a little thing. We haven't had sort of cycles to expand on it, but it's still a great game for anyone who wants to check it out. And we also have done the card game Illimat with the Decemberists and the Adventure Zone game with the McElroy brothers, Bureau of Balance. And in addition, we've sort of spun off KB Presents as a sort of imprint of Together Studios that specifically does Eberron content for the DMs Guild. Our biggest product that we put out was Exploring Eberron, which we put out last year, which is a 300-page sort of book of all sorts of just little things in Eberron that I didn't get a chance to work on in official content. We've had a few small projects since then, Eberron Confidential, Dread Metro, but currently the thing I'm working on is called Frontiers of Eberron. And basically where most of the Eberron source books sort of focus on very large areas, what we're trying to do here is focus on a much smaller area, the contested border between Breland and Droim, which is a nation of monsters, and very much working in a lot of sort of traditional Western vibes, So I'd like to say, think of it as Deadwood with more trolls.
Awesome.
And that's something that I hope will be coming out third quarter this year. And I've been working on it for quite a while, but there have been some real life stuff that has slowed things down. I am actually in my Patreon, I've been running an ongoing game set in this sort of mini setting, if you will, for the last year, that any of my patrons can go and get a chance to play in a round of. And so that's been a lot of fun. So that's what I've been up to.
Sound fun. And describe it as Wild West and Eberron. Is that?
Yeah, it's wand slingers. So it's very much sort of trying to capture the same way that Eberron overall sort of takes film noir and pulp adventure and sort of winds those into a fantasy world. This takes the same sort of the setting. It is Eberron. It's everything everyone's familiar with from Eberron, but then because it is sort of on the frontier, on the edge of this contested land, creates interesting opportunities for stories. It's also part of what's interesting is because it's the border with Droim, the nation of monsters. One of the things Eberron has always done is taken a very different approach to monsters. And Droim is one of my favorite nations for that reason, is we essentially stop and say, Medusas are actually more intelligent than people. If they actually exist as a species, what kind of civilizations are they going to build? Like, a lot of
Sure.
intelligent monsters aren't presented as being as intelligent as they actually are. So Droim is where we look at what does a nation built by monsters look like. And here, because it's the frontier, it's those two cultures coming together. And so it has a lot of opportunities to play characters that you wouldn't normally see. I'll say one of the characters in my ongoing campaign is a warg. So,
Wow.
so
Okay.
yeah, wargs, harpies, gargoyles, those are all things you can see
Sure.
out on the frontier.
Yeah. What do you have a? So it's a nation. Drone's a nation built by monsters. Is there a dominant monster species that leads it, or is it
No,
just a
so
collective of?
it's a collective. So the idea of Droim is it's where you had a lot of creatures that were sort of pushed off into the corner by the main human nations. And most of them had their own sort of separate cultures. And then 10 years ago in game time, a trio of hags, the daughters of Sora Kel, came and basically united these disparate cultures. So basically, you have a Medusa city-state, you have a goblin warlord. You have a group called the Great Pack, who are lycanthropes, ropes, and wargs. You have harpy flights in the mountains. So you have sort of subcultures spread around, but the point is they are now all coming together and uniting to build something new.
I see. Okay. Oh, that's great. And I think you said in your in the write up is going to be about a 300-page book, so not
Oh, it's
insignificant.
huge.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's amazing.
and it is the thing to me is that it's very much most of the source books focus on such a wide area of the world that you can't go into much depth. Whereas what Frontiers does is narrows the focus. So first off, we're just looking at this region that lies between Braylon, Droim, and the Eldine Reaches. So it's a much smaller area. So we can actually look at villages and like all these things that would be much too small to cover in like a book that only gives you 4 pages about a country. And then at the same time, Threshold, the which is in the name, is in particular a town of only about 2,000 people, right on the border between those two nations, and so it's right between and sort of dealing with people from both. And the point is, I give that the same focus here as I do give Sharn in Rising from the Last War, but it's a much smaller city. So again, we get to really get to know the people and the places in it. But you can, the book is going to support adventures all across the frontier, and it's good whether you want to run a campaign in it like I am now, or if you're just passing through that region, for other business.
Gotcha. And so you mentioned Warg as one of your players in your Patreon campaign. Is that going to be a common? Is that going to be material
That's
in
a
the
player
book
race.
to make monsters?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Wow.
That's awesome.
Yeah, there's going to be about 8 different traditionally monstrous species that that people can play. And I like wargs in particular just because, playing something like a gargoyle is interesting, but you're still fundamentally humanoid, whereas playing a warg sort of changes up the dynamic.
Completely different.
And so far it's gone really well. I've really enjoyed it. I've been running the campaign for a little over a year now. And it's fun because I'm running it for all of my Patreon. And one of the things, since we said we were talking about world building a bit, is in deciding to run a game for my Patreon, what I wanted to do was do something where everybody who's a patron can participate in some way. And essentially every session, I put out a little creative challenge, and the characters are continuous, but the players are chosen sort of each week. But part of it was that when we started this out, I basically posed a lot of different questions through polls to all the patrons. Let's talk about the town. Let's talk about who the characters are. So we have a roster of 10 characters. Let's establish details about them. And so essentially, when we usually talk about world building, but really what's important is setting building. Because in this case, the town is essentially the world of this campaign. That we've never gone more than 10 miles from this town in the year that we've been on it. And so the point is, well, we haven't really talked much about the world, but I involved all of the players, even those who may not have a chance to play, in the opportunity to add details and to make the world feel sort of meaningful to them. And so that's something I'm constantly trying to do. I've been running some little sort of story hours that end up being a sort of choose your own adventure where people can vote on the outcome. And just as a way to say, oh, I have a couple hundred patrons, only 6 get to play at a time, but how does everybody get to feel like they have a stake in the world? So.
That actually leads into a question I had regarding the setting is how much, I mean, Eberron has been going on for so long and is so expansive. How much of the new setting and expansion is from your original concept, and how much is just like, oh, I got this great idea from, a peanut butter commercial, something like that, or input from other people?
When you say new, do you mean Rising from the Last War? Or do you mean like my Exploring Eberron book?
Well, just everything really that you've done from the very beginning original seed idea. How much now is still part of that original seed idea, and how much is like, oh, this guy told me a thing and I thought about it and it was great?
It's definitely some of both. Part of the point of Eberron from the very beginning is we always sort of said that what we really want, I love making my own games, and I love people making their own games. And part of what we said with Eberron from the beginning is we wanted people to use it as a source of inspiration rather than as a restriction on the stories you can tell. All the canon material is a place to start, but you should always feel empowered as a game master to change it in your campaign. And so because of that, part of it is Eberron has always been a little looser. Like one of the sort of key differences between it and a number of other settings in Wizards sort of stable is we have major things like the Cause of the Morning, this disaster that destroyed one of the major nations, that we said at the start, we are never going to tell you what caused that, and we never have. And the reason for that is we want each GM to decide in their campaign what caused that, because that'll help shape their story. So part of the point is like that, Eberron had a lot of sort of blank space. And a lot of what we have done over the last 20 years is to sort of pencil in and fill in details. Like a big example of that is the planes. When we created Eberron, we created 13 unique planes. We said it's not part of the Great Wheel, it's its own cosmology, and here's its 13 planes. But then over the next 15 years, we never really gave those planes more than a paragraph of description anywhere. And so part of the thing was it had this cool new cosmology and yet very little for people to actually go on in terms of running adventures there. And so one of the big elements of Exploring Eberron is I actually go into detail on all of those planes. Now, the point is I had a broad concept. I did have ideas of what these places were like back 15 years ago, but I didn't actually, until 2 years ago, I didn't actually sit down and say, I'm really going to think about what makes Fernia cool, because I just didn't have time. And so likewise, from the very beginning when we submitted the setting, part of the idea of Eberron was I was like, there's aquatic civilizations. The Suagin should have their own nations. Like when you cross the water, you are going through their nation. And that idea was there, but again, it never got picked up and we never developed it in detail. So Exploring Eberron, I finally went deeper, if you will, than I had. Like the idea was always there, the Sahuagin have a dominion, but it's only now that I've had the time to really go into detail. That happens a lot on my website too, keithbaker.com. I will answer questions. Basically, people propose topics that I'll go into. And it is funny because a lot of times people will ask me things like, someone just asked me recently, because it's the last article I wrote. Someone basically said, well, where do they use Taroka in Eberron? And my point is, I don't just have an answer to that. I mean, I could just say, Undair, but so what? Like for a question like that, I want to stop and think and say, well, what is Taroka in Eberron? Like, who would use it? Why would they use it? What power do they think is guiding the cards? And so I have written an article about that now, but that is the point, is that it's not like I have a vast 8,000 page document that has all these answers. It's that there is a lot of blank space, and what I have to do is stop and say, what's the logical answer? What makes sense to me based on what we already have? So I think the answer to your question is basically a lot of new things. It's not that they necessarily come up from seeing a peanut butter commercial, but A, they could, if there was a really good peanut butter commercial yesterday, and B, a lot of what they do is we have seeds in the past,
Right.
and I'm picking those up, looking at those, saying, what have we said and what seems cool? Because always, whenever I'm working on something new, whether it's the planes, whether it's under aquatic civilizations, I'm always looking at this from the perspective of what is going to make a fun story. Like, how is this interesting? And just coming back to general world building, that is one of my basic design philosophies that I think is super important, is when you're adding details on any sort of lore, always be stopping to think, how is this actually going to matter to a player or a game master? Why will anyone care? Why is this actually fun? And it's very easy for us to just add details for detail's sake. But if you add too much that doesn't actually have a purpose, it just ends up sort of becoming homework for people and just sort of getting in the way.
Right. You want to be immersive, but not smothering.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, makes sense.
Yeah, and that is basically, again, the sort of the core idea of Eberron that I always am telling people is take what you want, use what inspires you, and if there's something that just doesn't work, change it so it does work. It's the value of using a pre-established campaign is, first of all, that it gives you a common language with other people, common ideas that I can describe to you and you share, and that it saves you time, that you don't have time to establish all the details, all the religions, all the histories. But that doesn't mean that you can't add details. If you've just seen that peanut butter commercial and you're like, oh, that's perfect, I want to tell that story, tell that story. Add peanut butter to Eberron. I'm not going to stop you,
I'm glad that was my contribution to this talk is the peanut butter analogy.
Forever. I'm going to say peanut butter Skeeter. PB Ski.
Oh, I am sure that will catch on.
PB Ski. There we
Jimmy's
go.
laughing about it right now.
All right.
So we back to world. So world building a little bit. Well, a lot, I think. Eberron was originally. It came from a Wizards contest, right? Wasn't it? It was a contest to see for the next world that was going to be built. How much Eberron did you have prior to your submission, and what sort of inspired that? What sort of inspired the world to begin with?
So absolutely none. Eberron was a complete original creation for the fantasy setting search. So the fantasy setting search was a thing where Wizards did an open call and said, send us a one-page description of a world. And it had a very strict, tell us who the heroes are, tell us how magic works, tell us, what adventures people will have. I sent in 7 ideas because there was no limit. Eberron was the last one I wrote. And it was based on the fact that for 3 years prior, I had been working as lead designer on a massively multiplayer online role-playing game called Lost Continents that was a pulp-themed MMO, which never ended up coming out. Basically, it got canceled. I said, I'm going to go freelance full-time. And then Wizards did the setting search. And it was entirely based on, I'd spent the last 3 years watching things like Raiders of the Lost Ark and Republic serials. I've always filmed noir. And honestly, the opening of that one page is a one paragraph short story that's just, Mickey Redblade was sharpening his dagger when she walked in. She was 3 feet of trouble, the most beautiful halfling he'd ever seen. But he could see it in her eyes. She was in danger. And it was basically, I was just like, well, what if you took this sort of pulp and noir flavor, which I've been running through my brain for so long, and just dropped that onto D&D? So what I will say is it didn't exist as a campaign. Like, I never run a game in Eberron. The other idea, however, that was always there is I had always had a long interest in the fact that arcane magic in D&D behaves scientifically. Like, it acts like a science. It looks like a science. And in particular, I had a campaign I'd run earlier where essentially the elves had a cyberpunk civilization, because I basically just said, well, the magic is science and the elves are going to be much more advanced magically than other nations. So I'm going to treat that as if they are essentially just a higher tech civilization than the rest of the world. So while everyone else is medieval, like, the elves are running around essentially with their own version of the internet and, stuff like that.
Biotech.
Right. And the principle is that, again, that didn't translate over. I will say to some degree, those elves actually linger a little in the gnomes of Zilargo, because the elves were like cutthroat, business folks. But that idea of saying, if magic in D&D acts in a scientific manner, shouldn't it evolve and be used as a tool the same way that we have harnessed technology? And so those were the 3 key principles of Eberron: pulp action, noir intrigue, magic as science, advanced. And I was surprised as anybody when they said they wanted to see more. I was like, oh, wow, okay, well, then I've got to figure out what more looks like. So basically, they picked that. I had to turn it into a 10-page document, which was the big, like, wow, okay, now I need to figure out how you actually play in this world. And then from 10 pages, they expanded it to 100 pages. And that's the one they picked, and that's what became the Eberron campaign setting eventually. And a lot of things changed over that time. Like, when I was originally envisioning it, I was very much thinking of it as a world that was sort of roughly closer to like the 1920s or 30s, where like wands, wand slingers had pretty much replaced like guns and, crossbows and bows and things like that.
Sure.
Like a world that fundamentally didn't feel medieval, but it felt magical. Now, when they were interested, basically part of the point was, this is great, we love it, but it needs to not be quite so far from D&D. So we sort of dialed back that level of, magical and technological advancement to where I say Eberron is a little more like a late 19th century now. We've got equivalents to the railroad, we've got equivalents to the telegraph, but people aren't teleporting everywhere. You do still use bows and crossbows and swords and things like that. And I think that was the right decision. I supported that. It was a little too far from D&D, but that tied to the fact that I didn't expect them to go for it. I just thought it was a fun idea.
Right. Yeah.
Aim for the stars.
Yeah. I suspect if wands take the place of guns in a 1930s type scenario, you kind of struggle with how to get people in. How are people still meleeing? Going to melee probably is a little bit of a
we're getting there
changes
with
the combat.
We're getting there with Frontiers. Wand slinging is an option, and part of that is because of 5th edition. In 3rd edition, it really wasn't plausible because the way magic worked. Now in 5th edition, or 4th when we had it, because you have at-will spells, basically now that cantrips exist, someone with magic initiate can be a wand slinger. There's still various sort of issues. Like, I don't want to make crossbows, among other things, crossbows and bows have a much better range. But still, the idea of a character who relies on a wand as their primary weapon, that's most warlocks and wizards, in a typical game. So it's actually sort of, it's funny that some of the changes The other thing that worked really well with Eberron that wasn't part of the game when it came out in 3rd edition is rituals. Because we have the whole idea that a lot of professional magic is sort of performed by people who aren't wizards. They're called mage rights, but like things like they'll
Mage
use
rights, yeah.
mending, they'll use knock, they'll use arcane lock, like that. Those are spells that they can do that they cast as rituals. Because otherwise, using Vancian magic, it doesn't make any sense to say, oh, I'm an arcane locksmith, but I can only cast knock once per day. And then I'm done. Then I just put a sign on my door saying out to lunch.
Go
Whereas
home.
with rituals, it's just about time. I have the skill to cast knock. Do you have 10 minutes for me to cast it?
Yeah, sure.
So it is funny that is sort of one of these principles of it was designed with Eberron with D&D in mind, but as D&D has evolved, a lot of the changes actually have sort of make Eberron work better than it did for 3rd edition.
That leads into my next question, which was going to be about the conversion and how 5th edition has helped or hindered the
Generally,
Eberron
5th
mechanics.
edition, yeah, 5th edition has worked pretty well. I'm pretty happy with the changes we made for Rising from the Last War. So first of all, as I said, rituals there's a couple different things that work really well. Rituals work really well. Cantrips work really well. The general principle that NPCs and player characters don't follow the same rules is a huge thing. That Eberron was always based on that idea that player characters were supposed to be exceptional. And what we did is we added NPC classes like the Mage Right and the Adept. Or the Mage Right, the Adept I think already existed. But, basically we made more use of NPC classes than other settings had done because we wanted that idea that player characters are cooler than most people. 5th edition has just gone a little further and just said, don't worry about it too much. The NPCs do what NPCs do. And that, as I said, helps in this world where our goal is to have the players really stand out. So all of those are good things. I like generally the way that dragon marks have been implemented, where we've made them like sub-races. And I think that's worked pretty well. So overall, I don't think there's a lot of things that sort of have proved problematic. The main certainly is that the way we used to do dragon marks was as feat chains, which aren't really until potentially now, haven't been a thing in 5th edition. On the other hand, I generally like the approach we have taken with dragon marks, so I haven't missed that particularly. I think the thing that's been a little weird for some people is Eberron played well with the magic item creation rules, because since magic was very much approached as a science, 3rd edition having very concrete, this is how, this is exactly what it takes to make a magic item, fit with that well. And 5th edition is certainly a little more, loose about that, but you just have to sort of hand wave things a bit.
Sure.
Sounds like a supplement coming.
Yeah, well, I will say I have way too many things I want to write for Eberron. So I'm finishing Frontiers now. I have talked about a book that would be my version of, there was a source book called Magic of Eberron, and I've been sort of meaning to do my version of Magic of Eberron that would actually delve, more into how I handle things like that. So maybe.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, for sure.
That'd be interesting.
And I've always, from the day that it was announced, particularly once the artwork started coming out with Warforged and Titan Warforged and all that stuff, that really struck a chord with me. And I've always really loved there you go. Yep. There you go.
Yep.
And of course, our Warforged.
My Titan, yeah.
And what do we call it?
Sakura Kori is another of my favorite just Eberron specific minis. And it's kind of crazy to have something that just popped out of my nightmares and hey, I've got them on my shelf.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you. I won't sleep again.
I've seen the Titan. I haven't seen that one before. That's cool. That's a cool mini. That's
He's
great.
it's a very good figure. I have to say, I like the design of it even more than it's called a Sakura Kori. I like the overall depiction of it actually better than the picture that's in the Eberron campaign setting,
Oh,
and it's
wow.
just very solid. It's a really well designed mini.
Yeah.
So good work, Wizards.
Nicely done. Yeah. But I think, in particular, what I really like about Eberron is that you've turned a lot of the traditional norms, fantasy norms, on their head. The druids aren't necessarily just peace-loving, woodsy guys, and like you said, the gnomes of Zalago are definitely not your traditional gnome stereotype. So I really love that.
I love, one of my favorite memes is the meme of the Valinor elf with their double-bladed scimitar charging at an orc, and the caption is, one of these is a defender of nature and one of them's just
Right.
out looking for a fight. And of course, in
And
Eberron, it's not the one you
think it is. Yeah. Right.
And certainly the Zil gnomes in particular, I love, just because gnomes have so traditionally been just comic relief. Basically the Tinker gnomes from Dragonlance and such. And so the fact that the Zil gnomes in Eberron are like some of the most ruthless bastards you'll ever run across was just fun, sort of twisting things around a little. And a lot of what Eberron was about was just sort of saying, let's take these things that we've always tended to use one way and just think about, well, what's another way? The gnomes in particular was just saying, well, what do we know about gnomes? They're not strong, so they've got to be clever. They are skilled illusionists. They're good with alchemy. To me, this says deception, poison, and that they need to rely on, assassination and such rather than brute force, because they don't have the brute force. So it's just fun, sort of taking ideas like that and exploring places they could go.
Yep. And dinosaur riding halflings, and
makes it more interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm just saying, we've got halfling on a raptor. Gotta go.
Right. Well, we don't have to go just yet. We got just a couple more minutes. Is there anything you wanted to touch on projects that are coming up, or anything? What's your Patreon?
So my Patreon is, it's Keith Baker. And basically, it's a couple of different things. The base level is just about supporting my website, keithbaker.com. And I write articles primarily about Eberron, because that's primarily what people want to talk about. And so the main benefit on the Patreon is I occasionally do patron-exclusive content. And also what I do is I ask the patrons, every patron gets to ask a question each month. And I answer as many of those as I can, but those then tend to form the subject of the articles that I write. So as a patron, you're getting to sort of choose, like, because some things I can just answer in, 3 minutes just with the thing. Some things I'm like, someone says, well, what's the ethereal plane like in Eberron? And I'm like, that's a good question. It's going to take me 3 days to answer it, but here it is. So the main benefit of the Patreon, being a patron, is that you are supporting the site and getting to sort of influence the articles that appear. Then basically you add $1 to that, and that's the threshold level. And as a threshold patron, as I said, I've been running this campaign for over a year. You both have access to all the recorded sessions, both audio and visual, and also each month. Basically, Patreon won't let you draw names out of a hat. It's extremely strict that you cannot do anything random because it's anti-gambling laws. And so my original plan had been I would just pick patrons out of a hat for who could play in each session. I can't do that. But what I do is I run a poll to determine when the session will be, and then I present some sort of creative challenge. So for example, in this next session, the players are going to be going to Thelanis, the fairy court. And what I said was, tell me which character you want to play, because we have this roster of 10 characters. Tell me which character you want to play, and tell me something that they want. Because the idea is you may get Fae trying to make deals with you. And what is something your character really wants? and
Yeah.
then I look through all the submissions and decide which I think are fun. And this comes back to that basic point. If it means going into the session as a game master, I already have 5 little hooks, a hook from each character of, well, this is what
Right.
you've told me is something your character, that character desires. And so it's interesting as a game master because it is an ongoing story, but again, every session it's a different group of players playing things. You never quite get that familiarity with the players that you do in a normal campaign that's been
Yeah.
going on this long.
Right.
But because everybody shares the characters, because, as I said, we developed them communally with polls, like people have been pretty solid. And all the characters have the equivalent of flaws and ideals, where it's basically like, this is what the character likes, this is what the character doesn't like, and this will get you advantage or disadvantage. So, people have guidelines. You don't suddenly say that the peace-loving, honest marshal is suddenly a savage murder hobo. And as I said, so far that hasn't been an issue, but it is still interesting dealing with different players every time.
Yeah, that is some fun. So patreon.com/Keith Baker.
Keith Baker. I think it's just one
Easy.
word, Keith Baker.
Yeah, that's pretty easy. Okay.
And my website is keith-baker.com.
Okay. All right. Well, we are running up to the hour here, so we're gonna call it a day with you. But I really appreciate your time, and it was great talking with you again.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Keith.
The last opportunity that we had was on our monsters. Whose monster is it anyway? With the Taco,
which was a heap of
Warforged.
fun. I love the Taco Warforged.
It was hilarious. So if you haven't seen that, it should be here on our Twitch channel back in the archives. But we had Keith Baker and Whose Monsters Anyway creating the Taco Warforged. I think it was like a battlefield cleanup thing or something. I don't remember. It was
it was
hilarious.
Yeah, it was a good time.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I
Yes,
hope
sir.
that you have a wonderful time this weekend and good gaming to everyone out there.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks a lot, Keith.
We will be right back with Alphinius Gu of Gooey Cube here in about 15 to 20 minutes. And so if you're here, stick around. We've got more stuff to give away, and we'll be on for all the rest of the weekend. We'll see you in a few minutes.
All right. Take care.